I'm Big Don Luka, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm unfortunately not joined here by my co-host, Jaron, today, as he had some prior things that he kind of had to attend to. But nonetheless, we are going to be finishing out our player profiles. We only have one left with Kyrie Irving after we do this Luka Doncic one today. For those of you who haven't been introduced to this series, this is where we take a player from the Mavericks last year, and we obviously just sort of microanalyze his game, how he played all of last season, and we'll be doing that here with Luka today. Obviously another All-NBA first team year for him, one of his best offensive seasons, but definitely also probably, a season that featured the most triumph for him in a Dallas Mavericks uniform after coming off, a Western Conference Finals run. A lot more losing than he's really had to do since his rookie year. It was definitely a tough mental year for him, and I think that we could see that towards the end of the year. But it did feature some very stellar play, and Luka is obviously the single most integral part of this Mavericks roster going forward. So how they fine tune the rest of the roster around him is going to be very interesting to see. We'll talk a lot today about how the Mavericks roster wasn't necessarily curated or optimized around him as good as it could have been last year, or even if, it wasn't able, the players in the front office weren't able to, curate that roster to the best of their abilities to fit around Luka because of the lack of assets or whatever the case may be. It's still cause for discussion of, if we're looking at comparatively how Luka played, last year versus how, if the Mavericks are able to get some more optimal personnel in-house, how, they will be able to feature him this year. So this will be a huge deep dive upon Luka's game. Really excited for this podcast. And like I said, we only have one more player profile after this. That being Kyrie Irving, and then we'll be starting to hash out our draft profiles. Hopefully, Jaron will be back with me for the Kyrie Irving podcast. But nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and get cranking on this one with the Luka Doncic season in review for the 2022-2023 NBA season. But before we do that, here's an ad from our sponsor, Spotify for Podcasters. All right, guys. So getting into it, Luka is obviously the spearhead of, everything the Mavericks do from an offensive perspective. All NBA first team last year, he averaged 32.4 points per game, 8.0 assists per game, 8.6 rebounds per game. Definitely his, I think, highest counting stats of his career. If we're, just kind of across the board when you look at everything here, percentages were pretty in line, though, with what we've typically seen. He did play 36.2 minutes per game last year, which obviously you can kind of infer was, due to the Mavericks' lack of, personnel outside of him. They had a severe lack of playmaking and ball handling throughout the year. Now, Luka is obviously a guy that's going to play, above 30 minutes a game just due to his status. He even did so his rookie year, but you would like to get that number just slightly down if possible. Last year was, a great season for him. I mean, I can think back to that 7-game stretch kind of, at the end of December when he had that 60-point outing versus New York and the crazy buzzer beater to send it to overtime. Those 2 50-point games versus both the Spurs and Rockets, respectively. He obviously, elevated to a complete different tier when he was kind of tasked to do so this year. And, it was crazy to see, but it was also a load that, I wouldn't say isn't sustainable, especially if he's able to get his conditioning a little bit better. But it was a load that, is really hard to, burden for one singular player on a team, despite who's around him. And obviously some of the offensive duties that he had to handle, were kind of delegated to Kyrie once that move happened. But, once Jalen Brunson had left that Mavericks team at the beginning of the season, pre-trade deadline, Luka was bearing a lot of the load, and you could definitely, probably say that it kind of caught up to him at certain points throughout the season. I know the whole new MVP rule was 70 games and everything like that. Luka has, not played over 70 games since his rookie year, where he played 72 games. This past year, he played 66, and year before that he played 65. Year before that he played 66, and then that bubble season he played 61. Kind of crazy to think that it's been 4 seasons, if we're including the bubble, since the bubble. But it has been, obviously sort of roller coaster, in the NBA world since then. And Luka has kind of, unfortunately been dealing with some of these little nagging injuries, season to season. I wouldn't say enough to where the Mavericks, wouldn't have the wherewithal or the ability to be able to, withstand it. If they did build a proper roster, I wouldn't say that is completely sacrificial to the team, but given the personnel of the Mavericks, it obviously, it's going to be rough, in a season like last year, where Luka has to, shoulder that much of a burden. And, the team obviously simply wasn't able to perform up to standard and, fulfill their role. It's not a recipe for success, obviously, to shovel that much on one player. But, we've seen stars in the NBA in years past be able to, handle it just a little bit better, even if their team isn't winning as much. And, that obviously is something that we can kind of point towards in terms of Luka's conditioning. Just getting in a little bit better shape as his career progresses is going to be huge for his overall durability and sustainability as a player, because we don't want, any of these, little ankle pop-ups that, happen periodically throughout the last few years with him to culminate into something bigger, culminate into other leg issues, chronic ankle issues, something like that, that would really suck. So, it's not just the Mavericks in terms of them getting personnel to obviously curate and, sort of fit and fine tune the roster around Luka, but it's also on him to get into, that pristine shape to where, maybe if he makes a certain cut, there's not as much weight bearing down, things of that nature. Right. But at the same time, I'm not in the camp here that's, about to say that Luka is a guy that needs to lose a ton of weight or, needs to do X, Y, and Z. He is a professional athlete at the end of the day. He is in good shape. I'm not here to defame him or anything like that. But, from an NBA player's perspective, I think that we can all agree that, given that these egregious workloads that he's had to shoulder, it would be beneficial to his game as well as the Mavericks if, he could get his conditioning a little bit better. And, that kind of goes hand in hand with some of the things that we see throughout the course of the season, lackadaisical defense at times, not just, bad defense, a possession or two, but he'll have stretches throughout certain games, right, where he is, kind of in a no man's land on defense, kind of, letting guys blow past him, things of that nature. And, that can happen every once in a while, of course. I understand that not every possession is, going to be a stellar defense possession. It's the NBA, of course. But, if Luka could become a little bit more consistent on that end, I think that would really do leaps and bounds in terms of how he's viewed around the league. And I don't think he's a bad defender, especially when he tries. I mean, he's actually, I would say, an above average defender. But, it's really that effort level, that conditioning throughout the course of an 82 game season that, if you're not in pristine tip top shape, it can come back to bite you. Now, given the proper load managing and the techniques of health professionals in the NBA today, anybody is able to, sustain, playing through the regular season at their own pace, and then, subsequently the playoffs. But, for the Mavericks to yield the best results year after year, you'd like to just see a little less of that sprinkled in and, just a little bit more of, Luka being able to get in tip-top shape, because I do think that it would pay overall dividends to some of the injuries that he gets. He's a heavy contact player. He obviously drives a lot. And, as the season tends to go on and injuries sort of prevail, you see him defer more to being, a little less aggressive at certain junctures of certain games, just depending on the importance of the game. And, like I said, Luka is not going to be able to give A+ effort defensively every single possession. He's probably not going to be able to, get to the rim every single time. I'm not asking him to turn into a supernova here, but, my main point being is that him getting in better shape could definitely help things. But he is all NBA first team. He obviously, had an abundance of positives this year. I figured we just, sort of plow through the brief negatives before we got into everything. And, so let's go ahead and do it. I mean, last year I thought, from an offensive perspective, it was, Luka had probably taken charge for the most that he's ever in his whole career. We saw him elevate to a whole nother level in terms of, his offensive abilities. And, this is coming from, really every single facet of offensive basketball in terms of what Luka, I wouldn't say added to his game, but amplified would probably be the right word. We saw him be able to, pass out of the post. We saw him operate in the post a little bit more, especially, when those driving lanes weren't opening up for him, when, he was getting kind of absolutely, clamored in the paint. He played the smart game. He's typically getting guarded by guards that, even if they are lengthier, he does have a size advantage on. He was able to take advantage of that. And, last year, we saw him be able to pass out to the weak side, out of the post a lot more. We saw him, and by virtue of that, he was kind of able to do that because of his, mid-range sort of fall away jump shot in the post, end up, that was something that I think he featured a lot more last year. His ability to, do a drop step and just get into the lane, things of that nature. He was really clicking on all cylinders. And, other assets of his offensive game that were also bolstered, I thought, was honestly just his mid-range shooting in general. Really the last 2 seasons, he's elevated to a tier where he's just looked a lot more comfortable operating that area, contrary to the first few seasons of his career, when, I felt like he was a lot more drive and kick centric. If he wasn't able to, finish at the rim, or within inside 10 feet by a floater or something like that, it would obviously be a wraparound pass or something where he's, getting the ball back above the break, or, being able to hit a guy that's cutting, something like that. Right. But, these past 2 years, Luka has really tapped into that bag that every superstar in the NBA nowadays has to have in some sort of form or fashion, which is the mid-range jump shot. And I mean, he's been able to take guys off the dribble and just kind of settle. I wouldn't say that he just kind of dribbles and, just lulls the defense down into mid-range jump shots, kind of like Kyrie does conversely. But he, when he's granted those opportunities in the post, or he's getting the ball at the nail, he takes advantage. We saw, I think, a little bit more off-ball movement from Luka this year. The Mavericks, ran some pin downs to get him going downhill, some curl offs. But I wouldn't say that was a common stance that was happening every game. I still think Luka has not fully been optimized with his, astounding gravity in terms of an off-ball perspective. I still think that there's things to unlock in the toolbox, especially with another ball handler like Kyrie. Even if he doesn't come back, if the Mavericks do have another guy that attracts that much gravity, like a Kyrie, like a Jalen Brunson, to where, they can get you a bucket at any time as well. I think that'll operate, or be able to open up a lot of things for Luka from an off-ball perspective in terms of the screening he could do for other superstar, teammates and what have you, because we haven't really seen that ad nauseum in his career. There were a few possessions last year where he screened for Kyrie, and in the playoffs, I know the Mavericks experimented with him screening for Brunson sometimes, but there are layers to this, and I do think that that's another thing that the Mavericks could kind of expose, or really, if they can get into the wrinkle of that, Luka's offensive potential is, honestly limitless at that point, right? Especially if he can get to a point where his defense is at least league average on a nightly basis. Sometimes, depending on the gravity of the game, even above average, right? Those are like the recipes for success in terms of, what he can improve upon. But I mean, the guy already, of course, is, as uber talented as it gets. He shot a, career high 22 field goal attempts last year. Like I said, I mean, the Mavericks offense a lot of times was, almost Luka step back three, or, Luka, come off a Spain pick and roll, and facilitate to a big man or get to the rim, or bust. It was just a lot of direct actions involving him at the point of attack. And I mean, he capitalized time in and time out again, because he just has such a, ethereal sort of sense in terms of how he's able to see the game of basketball, right? It almost seems like he has a third eye out there at times, where he is able to kind of diagnose what the defense is doing before they even do it, especially when, it's pertaining to pick and roll coverages, things of that nature. He is able to just beat guys strictly from his head, and it's all instinctual based. It's truly a blessing to be able to get to cover him on a day-to-day basis. Not something I took for granted last year. And it was eye-opening to see, a guy with his magnitude, with his size, be able to, facilitate as well as be a three-level scorer, in every sort of form or fashion on offense. It was eye-opening, not from the perspective I hadn't watched him before this, of course, because, I definitely had, but once you start doing a podcast and stuff, that adds a whole nother layer of coverage, and, just watching the team every day religiously. And it was pretty insane to watch. I can see why, some of the Maverick fans of old covet Dirk, and, now Luka, of course, as much as they do, because, he really does make magic happen on the basketball court. No pun intended. But I mean, barring just some of the things that, we've grown accustomed to seeing from Luka this past season, and some of the things that he's, kind of been able to add or kind of amplify within his game. Last season, of course, he still stayed very consistent with the staples of his game. The ability to make like insane cross-court passes, the ability to get a defender on his hip, probe in the pick and roll until he has an easy floater. When a guy goes under him on a screen, just pulling up for a step back three with confidence. We saw all that, right? And, I could, start microanalyzing or critiquing, his specific shot diet if I really wanted to, especially in terms of how it coincides with his, lack of conditioning throughout the whole season, and, how he tends to settle more for step back threes at certain points. But, I've already talked about that a little bit, and, kind of mentioned it. I feel like it is, at least there in the background. What's important is what he was, really able to do last year for the Mavericks. And, that's, being, a three-level scorer with the ability to get to the basket at a moment's notice, to just be able to turn, a defender around from a post perspective, be able to use a Euro step in the lane, be able to, just diagnose when driving lanes are going to be opening up based on certain pick and the roll coverages, how he can get the ball to a shooter's pocket, in the best possible position, just based on the defenses covering him, when he, should defer more to those step back threes, when he shouldn't, stuff like that. I still thought he did a pretty great job of, and, even like in terms of getting to the rim, this is something that I think we'd called for him to do a little bit more after the past two seasons. And, when I talk about Luka's conditioning, I I put an asterisk on it, because like I said, like he came into this year in better shape than the last previous 2 seasons where he, had that Olympic run, I believe the year before, and then he was doing like national team stuff this past year, and like the guy has been extremely busy playing basketball essentially year round. And this is the first time. I think he still has some stuff for Slovenia to do this summer if I don't stand corrected, but this is the first time he's really got a decent break from the sport. Been able to take more than like 2 weeks off, and I think that will definitely bode well. So don't think that I'm trying to discredit Luka or take anything away from him when I talk about the whole conditioning aspect of all of this. I do understand all the prerequisites of the burden that he has to carry for the Mavericks as well as how long he's been playing basketball. I'm not trying to knock the guy. All I'm saying is that, if he was in a little bit better shape, it would provide huge dividends for him in the Mavericks. I think that we can all agree that that's a fact. And I'm not saying that, it's expected of him or that he has to do that. I'm not an NBA player. I couldn't do what he's doing. I couldn't do any of this. So I'm not one to apply criticism from that perspective, but I can at least try to provide foresight to what I think, would happen if other things prevailed. So that'd be obviously optimal to see going forward. But nonetheless, to go back to what Luka had, continued to do just as good or if not better than at some points in his career this season, was that dribble drive game. He got to the free throw line 10.5 times per game, still kind of sitting around that, sort of mid-tier free throw percentage of 74.2%. Hasn't elevated beyond 75.8%, which was his second season in the league. So, his continued development as a shooter is definitely something to keep a keen eye on. But, when you do reach the volume of, the shots that he has, as well as the difficulty of the shots that he's taking, you have to give credit where it's due, because it's readily impressive, especially when defenses have had multiple years to diagnose how to cover you, when guys are more keyed in on you, especially, just given the status of Luka, how he's able to still, up his, points per game and his free throw attempts. And it was insane to watch, because Luka is obviously not the most, highlight real player at the end of the day. But to see the way that he's able to sort of orchestrate a masterpiece every game, and just hit guys in the right spots, it's truly, a beauty to be, part of just from covering. I've said that a few times, but I'm just so excited to see how the Mavericks can fully optimize him. If Kyrie does come back, what they could build around this team if they are able to, instill the proper defensive places, the proper shooters around him. Hopefully guys that aren't as one-dimensional as some of the Mavericks' current personnel. Maybe not a dynamic big man, but at least one that's more serviceable than the Mavericks had proven to provide last year. Now we can argue whether that's due to coaching, the front office and all that, but I'm just talking strictly about the facts. I think that we could see Luka's game elevate to a level that it, hasn't even elevated to yet, especially given what seems like an offseason that's going to be filled with more rest. He's going to have a lot more time to relax and get his body right. But he improved within the margins last year in a lot of important areas, like, getting back to the free throw line in a good clip, having that explosive first step that I felt like, wasn't as explosive maybe the last couple years, before that bubble season. He was in the best shape of his career last year, maybe only rivaled by that second season in the league, like I'd said. And, he can still get in better shape. That's why I've been saying everything I have. But it was, his dynamism from that perspective was really unbelievable to watch. He got a few more, he got a tick or two more steals than he has in his career with 1.4 last year. Like I said, instinctually, I think he's just getting a lot better defensively, being in the right place at the right time, being able to sort of read and react off ball a little bit better, not take as many, of those gambles that we may have seen him take earlier in his career. He's getting a little smarter. Only 3.6 turnovers per game last year. He'd been above, well, in the mid fours the last 3 seasons since his rookie year. And, with increased playing time, that's something that, to get down almost basically a whole turnover a game was really impressive, considering that there were times, throughout the season that, it felt like Luka was turning the ball over a little bit more. But, at the end of the day, in retrospect, I honestly kind of noticed that there were a lot of those games where, yeah, he may have a high dosage turnover game, but he corrected the next night. And that's kind of the thing with Luka in terms of if the Mavericks, can get those 3-and-D wings and that rim running, stretch five or whatever the archetype is that, we think would be most appropriate to, surround him and hopefully Kyrie. What does full optimization Luka look like? Does it necessarily constitute that he's going to have higher counting stats? Maybe not. I mean, maybe there's a little bit more spreading the love going around. I sure think he'd probably have higher assist numbers. He's a guy who really makes an effort to get guys involved. I mean, sometimes even at his own expense. I mean, there was multiple times this season where he probably could have took, heat of the offense a little bit more than he did. And he would kind of defer, and we've seen him at times get into the paint and pass out of favorable scenarios. Now, I think he did a better job of that this season, but if Luka is sitting around that 3 turnover a game, number, he's a little more conditioned, locked in on defense. It's going to be a scary sight if the Mavericks are able to effectively surround the right personnel, even if he doesn't improve his shooting. If he even improves his shooting marginally, I thought his best shooting season was probably the year before last, where he shot 35.3% from three. I mean, if he can just even get to that on a consistent basis and get that free throw level somewhere near 80 or around 80 at some point of his career, I mean, you're looking at a guy who essentially has no holes in his game. I mean, he can even be a solid defender, even if not an elite one day. So the sky is obviously the limit. 24-year-old superstar. And the Mavericks have a lot on their plate in terms of being able to surround the roster with adequate talent, because losing this guy would probably be, single-handedly, one of the bigger travesties in franchise history, maybe only rivaled by the Mavericks inability to surround Dirk with talent in his latter years. Losing Luka just straight up one day would really, really suck. Now, obviously, Luka had his first year of his rookie extension last year. So, he's making big money now. We got him locked up, but he is slotted, I believe, to be a free agent in the 2025 offseason, if I'm not mistaken. I may need to fact check that to be sure, but I wouldn't say that the clock is ticking on the Mavericks, but it kind of is from a certain perspective, because we talked about it ad nauseum all year. Luka obviously, was a little less joyous throughout the course of the year in a losing season for the Mavericks, one where they didn't even crack 500. The only other time that this has happened in his whole career was his rookie year, but it was also like Dirk's last year, and the expectations weren't as high. This is the first time that we've seen something kind of like this. And, were this to persist, I feel like, some fans have a preconceived idea that, European superstars are just, devoutly loyal because they see Giannis and they see Dirk. I mean, I don't think that where they're from necessarily constitutes their loyalness or not. I, do think, obviously they're culturally different, but I still think, granted, if things were to go completely haywire in Dallas, then I don't think Luka would, just concede and, take pay cuts to keep trying to improve the roster. The time is now, and the Mavericks need to figure it out so it doesn't get to that point. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Luka, would stay overtly loyal to the Mavericks, and, we'd at least have that in our back pocket, even if it just takes years and years to get a roster around him. But I mean, he's starting to enter his mid-prime now, which is crazy to say because he's been in the league for 5 years. You'd think that, he would be like 28 or 29 at this point. But, of course, coming in so young, he's this highly touted prospect. He's only going to be 25 or turn 25 during the season, 24 for some of the season next year. So there's obviously, a huge opportunity here for the Mavericks to really capitalize, because, another season or two, who knows what happens in this day and age with guys making trade requests. I just another, failed or missed season, as you're trying to capitalize upon Luka Doncic's mid prime. I mean, I wouldn't even know if I mean, I don't know unless, you know, at the rate that he's going, where he's at least fine tuning, some of the intricacies through his game year after year, he's still improving miraculously. And I mean, if he were to do that this year, with some of the things that I kind of outlined at the beginning, that would be, insane. I mean, he had a career high in field goal percentage last year at 49.6, was just getting to the rim more. Even if we did see that ability wane at the tail end of the season, I mean, his first like 50 games or so until All-Star break was just chaos from an opposing team's perspective. It just didn't look like there was any way you could stop him. It was really fun to watch, even if the Mavericks had no answer for teams on the other end defensively. So if he is, able to, improve around the margins, even more so, then the Mavericks are set up in terms of having done the hard part, having got that superstar player, having got that complete 1A best player on a championship team. They just have to curate the roster behind him, with their allotted assets and, manage their cap correctly. This is not just a 1-year project, or guys, I know a lot of people are, very locked into this offseason and how it's going to go. As am I. I do think it's probably one of the more important off seasons in franchise history due to the volatility of superstars in today's NBA, and what could happen with Kyrie, of course, too, which is a huge piece that we'll get into in the next podcast, and of course had the future implications with Luka and how he views the Mavericks going forward. This offseason is massive, but it doesn't just end there. Like the Mavericks, if only 1 out of 30 teams wins the finals every year, they need to be diligent in making sure they're putting the best product on the court every year. So even if they don't win that ultimate goal of a championship, Luka is still in the is in lockstep with the Mavericks and still wants to be here, still wants to win in Dallas. You don't have to. I don't think of things as like we're missing a certain championship window here with Luka. That's something that maybe like when he gets to like 28, 29, 30, 31, maybe we start to develop that narrative of, oh, he hasn't won a championship yet. Why, does he just want to go elsewhere? I think he's still locked in trying to win with one team, but if the Mavericks aren't, obviously carrying on their part of the deal, that's where I think complications could arise in terms of his future in Dallas. But look, he's still under contract until I believe the 2025 offseason. I can fact check this real quick. I just want to confirm this. Yes. So signed a 5-year. Yes. I mean, he'll be under, he'll be earning around 40 million at the end of that contract. And I believe he's only going to be, if he's 24 now, give or take 2 years. Yeah, he'll be like 26, 27, really entering the bulk of his prime. Those 3 years from kind of where you're like 26 to 30 is considered most guys' primes. And I mean, that's, where Luke is going to get a massive deal on this new CBA from whoever team, but he can obviously earn the most with the Mavericks. That 5-year supermax, and that's going to be, something that needs to be made a huge priority in terms of how the Mavericks operate with their franchise. Because he is the epicenter of this whole thing. He is what makes the years work from everybody else's perspective. The Mavericks could build the perfect roster this offseason, but if even if they still have Kyrie, it's gonna be hard for them to get to the promised land still without Luka. I mean, that's just he essentially just alleviates so much different stresses offensively that a lot of NBA teams have to worry about from an offensive creation standpoint. But being able to shoulder a little bit of that burden, a lot of NBA teams have a lot of they have multiple sort of 2B or 3C sort of guys, leading that offensive attack. But at the end of the day, none of those guys, have as high of maybe a usage rate as Luka. If they can just get if they can retain Kyrie, add a little more dynamism offensively, not as become one, not be as one dimensional, it would do leaps and bounds for the Mavericks, and I can, sit here and try and diagnose Luka's holistic game, at the end of the day, from an offensive and defensive perspective, all I want, but I couldn't really do justice. I would need like 24 hours to really just get into everything because, just how truly insane he is as a player. But I mean, last year he elevated to yet another tier, right? And the Mavericks have to elevate with him, because if they keep going backwards as he's going forwards, that's when problems are going to be prevailing. And Mavs land and the Mainstream Mavs podcast could become a much more somber sort of setting. But we we got to be cautiously optimistic. The Mavericks haven't proven free agency after free agency that they're, or just rather off season after off season. I don't even like using the word free agency, just given all the other added layers of team building that persist nowadays, especially with the new CBA and everything. But the Mavericks, they can't keep going backwards, and that'll be a huge test. So everything's huge right now. Luka's huge. The Mavericks off season's huge. Let's see what happens. But I mean, Luka himself is outstanding. Yes, there are some things, as I kind of covered, if he's able to fine tune his shot there at the course of his career, get his conditioning a little bit better. I mean, you could, really look at the second coming of one of the better players in league history from an offense perspective. Maybe, the second coming of, LeBron in terms of the longevity he may be able to hold here if he's able to do some of those things. But, that's just projecting. In terms of even looking at the here and the now, if this is peak Luka, if this is all we get, the Mavericks still have a guy that can win you a championship given the right pieces. So it is quintessential to the Mavericks being that this offseason goes accordingly. So we'll just have to see what happens from that perspective. But now if we kind of want to just go into some of the more structured things of the season review things, because I kind of just glossed all over the place, with Luka there, and just kind of talked randomly about everything to do with his game. But I mean, I kind of wanted to just go unscripted because I felt that would be the best way for my thoughts to not be diluted or anything like that. Just get everything off the top of my head in terms of how great he is, because I think that he deserves that due diligence, right? But like I said, let's kind of adhere to the structure here, like we've done with these other season review podcasts. Biggest improvement from previous year. I would say Luka's probably, we talked about this on the podcast, but I would say Luka's probably biggest improvement from the 2021-22 season. I would say probably his post game, but even more so probably his dribble drive game. And I was only hesitant to say that because he was good at that at one point in his career. Or not that, I mean, this all sounds so convoluted. He's obviously always been amazing at that, but he obviously, it elevated it to another tier. You can see by the free throw attempts in that 2019-20 bubble season. And he was able to get it to a point even where he was doing better this year. So I would probably say that in his post-up game. Biggest thing Luka needs to improve upon next year. I've already talked about this kind of throughout the podcast, just in terms of the things that he could sort of fine tune around the margins to be a little bit better. But one thing I haven't talked about yet was the complaining to referees, the getting back on defense. I think that more so than anything is going to fall into the fixable or patchable category. It's not something that requires a lot of hard physical work, but it will require a lot of him, doing his due diligence mentally and trying to get locked in, realizing that there is more at stake. He does cost his team at certain portions throughout games. He is obviously carrying a huge burden, but that doesn't excuse, when he's complaining to refs, when he gets so many technicals in a season. I think 2 years in a row now, it's where he has to get suspended for a game late in the year. I think this year it got rescinded in the latter, or the last few games, but I mean, things of that nature, and, just costing his team possessions on defense by not getting back and, leaving a 5-on-4 scenario, that'll be huge. I think, as Luka's game has got progressively better throughout his career, I think the complaining to ref stuff has got progressively worse. I think it's got a little worse every year. He kind of maybe views himself at a different status every single year in terms of the way he's able to talk to, the way that he talks to referees, or the calls he thinks he should be getting. And, he is justified in a lot. I mean, he gets a lot of contact. He also, initiates a lot of contact just due to his play style. But there are instances where I think it's warranted. I'm not saying that referees are perfect or that they receive the benefit of the doubt every time, but I think that Luka would benefit a little bit from, when it's those kind of 50-50 calls, just, putting up or shutting up and getting back on defense. That would be, huge. And, just that could end up affecting the Mavericks win-wise, maybe a few more wins a year, marginally. You never know what could have happened last year from that perspective. So that's obviously something he's going to need to, continue to fix. I know he says he's going to fix it every year, but he never does. So it may just be something we have to live with, but we'll have to see going forward because it obviously provides a huge hamper on certain stretches throughout certain games and can sort of derail the momentum when, Luka doesn't get back for a possession or two. So, and there's really nobody to call him out because of his status on the team. So, having a guy like Kyrie to be able to do that next year, if he wants to, sort of tap into that leadership role a little more vocally, because Luka's, a guy that tends to lead a little bit more by example. That'll be an interesting dynamic, and especially just seeing how they play together next year and how they delegate, the offensive possessions with each other if they play more synchronized with each other, as they were starting to kind of get the gist of at the end of the season. There will be a fascinating development to see if Kyrie stays. This is the season review podcast, so we review the players and talk about them individually, of course, but I do want to reserve a future podcast this offseason for just the Luka and Kyrie pairing and how it could look going forward, especially once they're fully optimized, if Kyrie does come back to the Mavericks, that is, and how they can better play together, because while they did start to get good at trading off possessions and they did have some more actions involved, directly involving each other at the later part of the season there, I still think that there's some more things that Jason Kidd can unlock in the toolbox that are sort of untapped. So that's going to be fun to microanalyze this offseason if we, sit down, break some film down, stuff like that. That would be really fun, and I think it's something that deserves a talking point, to say the least, because the absolute insane offensive production that those two together can yield. Otherwise, if we're gonna diagnose Luka's sustainability rating, my bad, following the structure of this player profile right here, I would say for this year specifically, I would go 8 out of 10, just for the off chance. Maybe 9 out of 10, maybe 9 out of 10. He's obviously, the one untouchable on the Mavericks, I would say. Pretty definitively, he's, not going anywhere or anything like that. But, if the Mavericks were just to drastically screw things up, I would probably say 9 out of 10, just in that off scenario that he somehow leaves by the trade deadline. And he demands a trade because the Mavericks are like 20 and like 32 or some shit like that. But that's obviously not something we want to think about. So I would say probably 9 out of 10, because I can't say 10 out of 10 for anybody. I mean, that would be a disservice unless the Mavericks were just coming off, a deep playoff run or a finals run and they still have Luka. Like, I'd probably say 10 out of 10 at that point. But I do think he'll at least be on the team for this season, like in extremely, I can say that in with pretty extreme confidence, and that's going to happen in all likelihood. But could the problems persist next offseason? Potentially that the ensuing trade deadline of the 2024-25 season. I mean, maybe it's I wouldn't say unlikely, but I wouldn't say likely, but it's not unlikely is what I would probably kind of say on that. So I'd probably say 9 out of 10. And then my one surprising stat for Luka, not nearly surprising, but he had the second highest usage rate in the NBA this year. I was thinking of trying to figure out some sort of crazy stat to do with his defense or, something with his pace or his effort. But I mean, I just, your boy's only got so much capacity for the research on second spectrum that I can find with NBA.com, especially as I try to get better with the filters and everything on here. And, I don't have access to some of the more advanced stats that you can kind of find out there on Twitter and stuff like that. So I just thought, simplistically, I think his usage percentage says a lot about how his season played out last year, about the burden that he had to carry for this Mavericks team that, was severely understaffed at certain, places, and as far as their personnel goes, and, with their wings and their ability to produce in the big man spot, all things that are, of course, hugely important, obviously the third ball handler spot too. throughout large stretches of the season. Even with Dinwiddie, that was a huge thing in terms of Luka's production, and just having more one-dimensional players offensively, even if we're not talking about Kyrie or Dinwiddie or the second or third ball handle or whatever it is, right? Or even Jaden Hardy's late year ascension. All those promising things that kind of persisted throughout the season from help that Luka got were not near enough to undermine the one dimensionality of some of the wings on this roster, as well as the lack of ball handling and offensive creation from other outlets. Whether being Christian Wood not playing enough, whatever it was. Luka had a usage percentage of 37.5% last year. It was only second in the league to Giannis, and idealistically that's got to go down a little bit. Giannis's usage percentage is that high, but he also has the surrounding pieces to be able to win a championship. I mean, I say that don't take that verbatim because he obviously didn't get there that year, but theoretically on paper they're at least good enough. The Mavericks aren't even good enough theoretically on paper, right? So if they can at least get there, then they're in the discussion point of then they actually got to do it, and we'll see what happens. And that's when we start diagnosing head coaching moves during the playoffs. Somewhere where I wish we were right now, in the finals, but not like any of the other NBA team centric podcasts besides the Heat and the Nuggets are there. So we'll take our blessings where we can. But yeah, I mean, that usage percentage extremely high. If Luka can get that down, even marginally, or I mean, even if it goes up at the Mavericks, just have come to optimize, playing around him a little bit more. But just given the guy, and his assist numbers go up and the usage percentage goes up, that's fine. Or the usage percentage just goes down a little bit. But I mean, it's truly emblematic of how the Mavericks used him, and how the supporting cast was put around Luka last year. But barring that, I don't got too much more for you guys today in terms of Luka. I felt like I took a big holistic approach. I mean, I obviously can't get in heavy detail about every sort of segment of Luka's season. I can only get into as much as my mind allowed me. But I mean, I main thing I wanted to stress throughout this broadcast was just the importance of this offseason, and how that's going to be conducive to Luka's future in Dallas, because that is what we need to be concerned about right now. But I mean, Luka had a great season, another All-NBA first team appearance. A lot of people would say he was maybe undeserving of that. I'm kind of on the fence if he deserved it or not, but I wouldn't say that he didn't deserve it as well. He had a hell of a season, and I'm glad that he was able to get that. I don't know if that has any implications in terms of his supermax or anything like that. I don't think he is, because he's been a perpetual All-NBA guy. So I don't really, I need to get another read up on my CBA knowledge. I've been kind of lacking recently. But I mean, yeah, I mean, this is the spearhead. This is the 1A best player on the Dallas Mavericks, and this is the Dallas Mavericks podcast, the Mainstream Mavs podcast. And the Mavericks got their work cut out for him in terms of surrounding Luka with adequate talent, because he is amazing, and all glory to him, because hopefully he leads us to the promised land one day. That is the hope. And we can end the podcast with Holly Luka. I won't praise Luka in a religious sense, just due to other things. But I will say that if there was somebody in my life, an earthly being, that I did have to, devout my life and my faith to, if that was a scenario that were somehow real in my life, then it would be Luka. So let's continue to treat him as we have continued to do as far as fans go, and we'll see where this thing goes forward. But this has been Will today, covering up Luka's season review for the past 2022-2023 season, in terms of how he fared this past season for the Mavericks and what to look to as we go forward in his career. It's been an exciting podcast. Can't wait to get back on the mic and do this Kyrie one with Jaron here whenever we get a chance to crack that out. We'll also be getting into the whole rumors with LeBron, and that whole Kyrie LeBron, coming to Dallas rumor, air quotes. We'll be getting into all that sort of stuff. So it's exciting. We're going to be hashing out a lot of content. Obviously, we just got that other player profile season review podcast that you guys can check out. It's our last episode that we did Reggie Bullock, Tim Hardaway Jr., and Maxi Kleber on. But yeah, barring that, make sure to follow us on Twitter at Mainstream214. We just got a new account. because we had to get rid of the old one, unfortunately. Make sure to follow us on YouTube, Mainstream Mavs Podcast. Give us a subscribe. Comment down below. What do you think Luka is going to average from the free throw line percentage-wise next year? Is he going to finally crack the 80% sphere? Is he gonna get within that realm? If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other podcast platform, make sure to give us a 5-star rating and a good review, or follow or subscribe, or whatever that button is, to make sure that you get notifications for our podcast. We would really appreciate that. We really appreciate you guys for sticking with us amidst this adversity with our whole Twitter situation. We're going to continue to pay dividends on that for you guys that have stuck with us. We really appreciate it, and we're excited for the summer and to cover the Mavericks and whatever they may do this summer, from summer league to all the moves that they're making. You can catch it all here on the Mainstream Mavs Podcast. This is Will, and I will catch you guys in the next one.